Now, when I was a kid, some of the movies I fell in love with were the original Star Wars trilogy, all the Indiana Jones movies, Ghostbusters 1 and 2, Terminator, Aliens, Mad Max, Blade Runner, the Transformers movie, and so on. And the funny thing about all of those movies is that even if you're a lot younger than I am, and mind you, I'm 41 years old, is that you've almost no doubt heard of all of them, and are probably even familiar with them because, well, they were great movies, of course, but also because most of them either have sequels that have come out recently or have been remade in some respect. In fact, when you start to look at the biggest movies of the last 20 years or so, or at least the most successful of what you might label a big blockbuster film, many of them, hell, almost all of them, are either sequels, remakes, or otherwise based on pre-existing material. And the sad reality of things is it seems like Hollywood produces almost nothing original these days. Again, at least in regards to big blockbuster films. Because sure, there are plenty of children's animated movies or lower production cost comedies, dramas, horror movies, and so on that occasionally do quite well and are completely original ideas. And yeah, I do understand the risk that comes with investing sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars into a movie that's an original concept and doesn't come with a built-in audience, or a movie that doesn't already have some sort of fan base out there because of a book series or some old cartoon or whatever else it might be to basically guarantee at least some ticket sales. But the somewhat ironic part here is that had that been the approach for the last 40 years or so, if movies had been made mostly off existing material for the last 4 decades now, almost all of those movies I mentioned at the top, save the Transformers movie, which I included mostly because I love it and the new films have made a ton of cash. Anyway, none of those movies would have ever been made because they were all original ideas and didn't come from some other source. And I know some of you will say, well, they weren't completely original ideas. A lot of them were loosely based on this or that, or the creator was heavily inspired or influenced by something they'd seen or read at one point in their life. And yes, you'd of course be right. Star Wars, for example, is a collage of many different ideas from many different sources, but it isn't even close to just a cut and paste copy of any one of them. Not to mention, it's really part of the goal of creating fiction, I'd say, especially sci-fi and fantasy, that you invigorate or inspire the imagination of the reader or viewer. I mean, I'd find it a little odd if today's top writers and directors said they hadn't been inspired by any of those movies I mentioned earlier. But unfortunately, and it's not really their fault, but today's writers and directors are pretty much just giving us those same movies all over again. They're inspiring the next generation with pretty much the same movies, quite literally, that they were inspired by. And in some cases, not all mind you, these new versions of them, or continuations of those original stories, aren't being handled all that well, or aren't nearly as good as what came before them. So not only is creativity being stifled, but the remakes oftentimes turn out to be inferior copies of the original because, well, usually they don't have the same passion behind them that the original creator had when they were making them. Or they try and take the story in a new and different direction to reimagine it, and then they lose sight of what the original was, and the existing fanbase wants no part of it because it's not what they love. And it becomes clear the only reason they used the original name in the first place was to try and take money from those fans, and not to honor the original work. Though I do think a lot of it also comes down to writers and directors wanting to tell their own stories. They want to have absolute artistic freedom over a project to shape it any way they see fit, which is certainly understandable. And some can't or don't work well within the constraints of an already existing universe, which isn't a knock on them or their abilities, it's just they're not suited to retell someone else's story or to carry it on. But a lot of the times they're tasked with doing it anyway, and they maybe don't have the right mindset going in, or at least not one the fans who love the franchise are going to appreciate. And again, they either try and subtly reimagine it, which angers the fans, or they copy and paste too much from the original and it ends up feeling like a cheap knockoff of the original, and doesn't have that same magic. And basically what I'm saying here is, it's not easy to take someone else's work and to continue it, or to reimagine it and retell it, especially if you don't have a true passion for it. And with all that being said, and not to now defend the remake or nostalgia era of film we currently live in, but true masterpieces of film can certainly be created from pre-existing material. Perhaps two of the greatest examples of this, though not the only ones, are the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Though in both those cases, it seems clear one of, if not the top priority, is to honor the original work and the fans who love it, their passion projects and labors of love for the recreators, and it shines through in the movies themselves. However, as I was talking about before, not every writer and director wants to replicate the magic of someone else's work. Many want to do their own thing and tell their own story, but unless you're maybe a James Cameron type, you don't just get to make whatever movie you want in Hollywood. Again, most studios don't want the risk of hundreds of millions of dollars being spent on someone's original idea, They want that built-in audience to lessen the risk. But speaking of James Cameron, he's the guy who brought us Avatar, which wasn't based off anything. Though, okay, you may want to point out, it does feel like Dances with Wolves in space, with magical interconnected trees. Anyway, it's currently the highest grossing film of all time, and it's likely going to be very difficult to dethrone. Why? Well, because there'd never been anything else quite like it before. It was, dare I say, an experience to see that movie in 3D in a theater. In fact, the last time I had people telling me I had to go see a movie, it was Avatar. And then after I saw it, I was telling people the same thing, that they need to see it, that it needs to be seen in the theater because it's a true experience. It was the first movie since maybe Jurassic Park, the first one, some 15 years before it, that truly wowed me and took my breath away. Though sure, there have been plenty of others that were truly impressive movies in between those two, like The Matrix, for example, or the aforementioned Lord of the Rings trilogy. But since Avatar has come out, I can't think of one single movie that really felt like a true experience while watching it, other than maybe Infinity War and maybe Endgame here in a couple weeks. But that's mostly because of all the build-up to the movie with the previous ones. It was the culmination of a decade's worth of storytelling, and that's what made it an experience, not so much the movie itself, though yeah, it was impressive, don't get me wrong, and likely Endgame will be too. And then there's The Force Awakens, which also felt like an event, at least leading up to the movie, but upon seeing it, I wouldn't say it was a true experience in the theater. Sure, it was a fine film, and I do like it for the most part, but I expect quite a bit more out of a Star Wars film. And the thing is, the more we keep remaking movies or retelling stories, the less likely we are to get another Avatar or another movie like the first Star Wars film. And I know I might be sounding contradictory or like a hypocrite, because here I am with a Star Wars/Marvel channel, and as I've said before, I do hope both of these franchises survive for years and decades to come. But the thing is, if nothing new ever comes along to challenge either one of them, if everyone just tries to be the next Star Wars or the next Marvel, and it seems like every movie studio out there right now wants to create their own shared universe to compete with Marvel. Anyway, if everyone only tries to be the next Marvel or the next Star Wars, or that's all movie studios allow their writers and directors to do, well, we're never going to have the first of something better than them, if that makes sense. We're never going to have something that truly competes with them or rivals them, or is again considered better. And it's hard for the best to keep getting better when they don't have any worthy competition, or they don't have any real need to actually get better. In fact, they tend to just get stagnant and decline when there's nothing to challenge them. And that's what some people don't seem to understand about why I will and have criticized the Disney era of Star Wars, especially The Last Jedi. A lot of people will call me a hater because I'll point out what I and others feel is wrong with it. But the thing is, I want Star Wars to get continually better if possible. I'm not coming at it from a position of hate, but one of care and concern. Because if you always just accept what you're given, if you don't point out the mistakes or problems or when someone is being lazy, they're not going to get any better or change their ways or try and improve. And I'm sorry, but for the most part, the sequel trilogy has been lazy and uninspired writing, and there's been almost nothing original or creative about it. And this is where I now begin my last Jedi rant before Star Wars Celebration this weekend, and when I will try to focus all of my attention forward to a hopefully very bright future. So anyway, I'm just going to try and get it all out of me, so hold on tight and let's do this. Okay, basically thus far the two biggest problems with the sequel trilogy have been a lack of planning, which I've discussed many times in other videos and won't really touch on here, and the fact that the sequel trilogy is telling the same story all over again, or the same one as the original trilogy, just with different characters and done nowhere near as well. And this of course all ties back into playing it safe, which is the theme of modern movies, that you don't take risks and you play off nostalgia in the hopes of getting people to fork over their money. And this is where some of you will want to point out that Rian Johnson didn't do that with The Last Jedi, that he took plenty of chances and risks and told a new and different story within the Star Wars galaxy. But here's the question I'd ask in response to that. Where exactly or in what respect did Rian Johnson take his chances or risks with The Last Jedi? Where is the creativity he injected? Well, if we look closely at the movie, we'll see he certainly didn't do it by expanding upon the lore in any unique way, unless you count introducing hyperspace ramming into the canon. Because the only expansion upon the lore is that, apparently, a light side user can quickly rise in power to meet the threat of a dark side user. Which, at best, is a slightly different take on the prophecy of the Chosen One, where a child will be born of the Force to destroy the Sith and bring balance, or something like that, because, well, we never actually learn the exact wording of the prophecy in the prequels. Either way, both stories are about someone being picked or created by the Force to stop the dark side. Okay, so no real risks or expansion upon the lore. So how about the story itself? What chances or risks were taken here? Well, and mind you, yes, it is difficult to come up with a completely original idea anymore. But really, this is a story, to break it down into the most basic form, about a girl who is our hero of the story that seeks out a master of a discipline she feels destined to learn, and to convince that master to return to a fight and to aid a faction that desperately needs his help. But the girl is rejected by the master on every level, and so she decides to take things into her own hands and confronts the enemy without any help or training, which traditionally is a very costly mistake by a young, inexperienced hero, and one that usually comes with a very high price. But in this case, the girl comes out of it relatively unscathed physically, though most likely with some emotional distress that will lead to a change or growth in her character. However, soon after this event, the character is shown relatively unfazed by the experience, and dare I say it, even seems cheerful. And in the end, she even helps rescue her comrades that have been relentlessly pursued throughout the course of the movie. And she does this with powers that, presumably, she'd initially gone to the master to learn in the first place, which makes her seeking out that master feel like it was irrelevant, because she already was skilled enough without training. Meanwhile, in a very classic trope, the master does indeed make his return to befuddle the villain in order to help facilitate the escape of the good guys, though he must give his life to do so. But we can safely assume, and are actually shown for some reason, that his actions have inspired others. So in terms of the story, it's not overly original, which can be okay if you can put a fresh spin on it or surprise us in some respect. Because as I said, it's hard to truly come up with a story that can't be compared or contrasted to another one that's already out there somewhere, and maybe many others that are out there. Anyway, by and large, this is a tried and true formula of a story where a student seeks out a master, but for one reason or another doesn't learn what they were supposed to, and then sets out against an enemy that they are unprepared for, only to be saved in the end by that master who has given their life because of the hero's mistake. But the sacrifice, of course, inspires the hero to future greatness. Hell, this is basically the general formula used by The Empire Strikes Back, though that movie did add some original elements or ideas or twists by first making the villain the father of our hero, and then by making it the unknown sister of the hero that does the saving in the end, not the master having to come and give their life to bail out the hero. The Empire Strikes Back also gave us no real sort of win for our hero on any level whatsoever, other than just surviving. The Last Jedi then shakes up this traditional story formula by making it so that the hero escapes on her own in the end, not with anyone's assistance, and doesn't apparently pay much of a price for her rash decision to face her enemy. And she also still secures a definitive and very impressive victory in the end by saving everyone else. In other words, despite what many will try and claim, no real risk was taken with the story or interesting dynamic added. This was pretty cut and paste outside of the surprise killing of Snoke, which just shifted who the main antagonist was and relieved Rian Johnson of the burden of having to explain Snoke's place in the story. And yes, the unexpected killing of Snoke then led to a few minutes of having to wonder about Kylo's true motivation for killing Snoke and saving Rey, and this was interesting, I'll give it that. And our time to ponder this gets drawn out by a fight where Rey and Kylo team up against the Praetorian Guards, and seems to imply that these two will now join together for good. But when Rey finally learned his true intentions, and they weren't good, this otherwise rather generic story had the chance to do something truly unexpected and interesting, to take a real risk or turn we didn't expect, by having Rey take Kylo Ren's hand and his offer to join him on the dark side. Okay, then we move on to characters, which is where Rian Johnson decided to get creative and take a risk, and primarily with Luke Skywalker. And look, I can almost admire his courage to do something so bold with Luke. Almost. The problem is trying to explain a massive character change or shift in their personality with just one scene or one moment, especially one viewed from multiple sources, so we can't even be entirely sure what happened, just isn't the best idea. Because many people just won't buy this without a lot more context. They cannot ever see Luke acting as he does in The Last Jedi, and one quick explanation isn't going to sell them on it. And so Rian Johnson essentially took a risk with the one thing, or the one aspect of the movie that was most likely to blow up in his face if it wasn't handled well. he didn't take his chance where he should have, that being with Rey, the new character that people would have been more open and accepting to if she radically veered off the course we expected. She was the character we wanted to see something or some sort of big change in. In fact, we were all expecting something big out of her. But instead, he did it with Luke, and it didn't work for most of the fans. And so outside of what was done with Luke, it was a very safe and bland story. And it's really the only place Rian Johnson truly got creative at all. And his explanations for Rey and Snoke, and most fans were looking forward to learning more about both of them, well, they were either utterly simplistic and generic, or no explanation was given at all. And don't even get me started on the entire Canto Bight subplot, which was utterly pointless and wasted about 20% of the movie. But here's the thing, it's not entirely Rian Johnson's fault, or at least it might not be. J.J. Abrams, of course, gave him the setup movie, which was The Force Awakens, a movie that introduced nothing original and was, at its core, a little more than an homage to the original trilogy and the ultimate nostalgia trip for Star Wars fans. Which, who knows, might have been exactly what J.J. was told to make by Disney and or Lucasfilm. He was told to play it safe with the first movie in the trilogy and to just reintroduce people to the galaxy far, far away. But there's something else to keep in mind with all of this, and that is that they, meaning Lucasfilm and or Disney, were the ones who approached J.J. Abrams to do Episode 7 in the first place, and he originally turned it down, till supposedly he was asked, who is Luke Skywalker? And that's what changed his mind. That's what made him want to do it and got him on board, even though he did nothing with Luke Skywalker in the movie, and so I really don't get that explanation. I also don't get why they essentially had to beg J.J. Abrams to do this movie. Why are you begging someone to do a Star Wars movie? To basically relaunch your whole franchise if that person really doesn't want to do it, if their heart doesn't seem to be in it. Because if it's me running Lucasfilm, I'm letting people come to me. I'm letting writers and directors beg me to do this movie. I'm first going to listen to people who have a passion for the franchise, who really want to do these movies, who want a crack at the sequel trilogy. And maybe they have a truly unique idea that's been in their heads for decades about what to do with these movies, though one that still stays true to what Star Wars has always been. The right writer and director could have given us the best of both worlds with this trilogy. Something new, yet that still felt like Star Wars at its core. And to that you might want to argue, well, if you let them come to you, if you bring in the superfan writer and director, you're only going to end up with glorified fan fiction. And to that I'd respond by saying, what exactly did we get from J.J. Abrams? All The Force Awakens really ends up doing or being is something to set up possibilities for characters and story arcs down the road. And I will say it did it in an interesting way, but when there was no payoff in the next movie, or when it took the story in an opposite direction, which The Last Jedi did, well, it just makes The Force Awakens feel pointless. Because the movie was the ultimate mystery box, without anything really being revealed or resolved other than the destruction of Starkiller Base, I suppose. It put everything on the next movie to answer and explain, and all it did story-wise was introduce us to another rebellion, fighting against another oppressive regime, and to one lone hero that was likely going to have to save us all, which is the exact same premise as the original trilogy. And yes, for whatever reason, I do enjoy The Force Awakens for what it is. I don't know, okay? But anyway, this was worse than fanfiction. This was just the same thing all over again. This was the ultimate example of playing it safe. And this story then got handed off to a guy, Rian Johnson, who didn't know what to do with any of it apparently. And so he drastically changed the character of Luke Skywalker to mask the fact that the movie centers around a ridiculous slow space chase that both sides could have handled 1,000 different ways that would have made a lot more sense than what they did do. I mean, when I watched The Last Jedi, I asked myself these two questions. First, what would Vader have done if he was with the First Order? And then what would Han have done if he was with the Resistance? Well, first of all, Vader would have swarmed the Resistance ships with TIE fighters, despite the fact that the Star Destroyers couldn't support them from that distance, I guess, and there would have been heavy losses. Anyway, Darth Vader, the guy who let a fleet of Star Destroyers get pummeled by asteroids in order to capture one ship, that being the Millennium Falcon, of course, well, he would have ended this chase as swiftly as possible without caring about the cost, which is part of what made him a great villain, and part of what makes the First Order a joke. As for what Han Solo would have done with the Resistance, well, instead of leading the First Order to the planet you were going to try and hide on, go the other direction and load up all those transports you have and fly them to Crate. In other words, hide and misdirect like a good smuggler. But then you might say they didn't have enough fuel for that. Well, then take one of them, the one that Finn and Rose used, and the one that has a hyperdrive and they flew away to waste a quarter of the movie. Anyway, you take that one and you start ferrying people somewhere else, somewhere safe. Or do both that and bring back fuel for the transport so that they can go to Crate or somewhere else. I mean, the movie tells us the First Order wasn't or couldn't scan for smaller ships for some stupid reason, because I guess they were just assuming the Resistance wouldn't try anything to sneakily get away, that they would just run themselves out of fuel and die without trying anything to save as many people as they possibly could. And try as I may, I just can't wrap my head around the idea that the First Order was following them for 18 hours and didn't seem concerned that they might try something to get away, especially as they approached an inhabitable planet that the Resistance was leading them to. How could no one on any of those Star Destroyers, none of those hundreds of thousands of members of the First Order, think to themselves as this was happening? That's an inhabitable planet we're flying towards. I wonder if they're purposely going this way and are going to try and hide on it somehow. Nah, just keep following that lead ship and don't scan for smaller ships or life signs as we go past the planet. We'll just follow the lead ship till it runs out of fuel and then immediately blow it up without boarding it and trying to take prisoners and realizing the ship's empty or getting other intel from their computers. Well, at least all this explains why Holdo didn't share her plan with anyone. She was embarrassed about how terrible it was, and that it relied entirely on the First Order being utterly incompetent to work. And look, if you love The Last Jedi, that's fine. It really is. I have no issue with you, and I'm not trying to insult or offend you or make you angry. I'm actually happy you enjoy the movie. Hell, I love the movie Masters of the Universe, and it's probably the worst movie ever made. And no, I'm not saying The Last Jedi was as poorly made as that, or even close to that. But The Last Jedi is not a cinematic masterpiece. And the primary reason for that is because almost none of the characters' actions make sense or can be understood. The movie is a classic case of a writer coming up with a grand vision for the ending of his story and then railroading all his characters to that ending, despite the fact it contradicts the way they would or should otherwise act. And the real crazy part is, I don't entirely blame Rian Johnson. He tried, I guess. The fault here lies with Kathleen Kennedy for having no real vision or not putting someone in place with a grand vision for the entire franchise, or at least the sequel trilogy. And there's a clip out there, and I wish I could find it, and if you have a link to it, please post it in the comments below, and I will pin it. Anyway, there is a clip where Kathleen Kennedy says that they approached The Force Awakens like any other big tentpole movie, and when I heard that, all I could think was, that is why you fail. Because even though the prequels were hit and miss with people, at least they were new and different from the original trilogy, and yet they still managed to feel like Star Wars and honor the originals. They felt like a cohesive part of the overall story. Not to mention, they were actually groundbreaking in terms of digital effects. They ushered in a new era of film, much like the originals had before them. And say what you will about George Lucas, but the man was a visionary, and he was always looking to push the boundaries of not only storytelling, but how to tell stories. And now what have the sequels done so far? And I stress so far because yes, there is still one movie to go, and I do have high hopes that something good will come of it. But so far, have they done anything to reshape the film industry or to usher in some sort of new age? Have these movies felt like a true experience when you watched them in the theater? Have they told a new and original story? Have they enhanced the previous two trilogies and expanded upon the overall lore of Star Wars? Or are they just like almost every other movie that comes out these days? Has Star Wars become like so many other failing franchises? And to wrap this up, because this is way longer than I wanted it to be, and I'm not even sure how cohesive it all is going to be, I do still have hope for the future of Star Wars. I have hope that the right people can be brought in or promoted in the case of Dave Filoni, and they can return the franchise to glory. I also have hope for Episode 9, as crazy as that sounds. And no, I don't think it's going to rescue the whole sequel trilogy and make the thing amazing. But I do think JJ is going to try and make the best damn Star Wars movie he can. And I really do hope he can pull that off somehow. Anyway, here's to the future of Star Wars. And to all of you out there who watch and support this channel, thank you for watching.